Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to introduce our final panel event of the day. This on the vital and topical subject of UK-US trade, and in particular the scope for a free trade agreement between our countries and what we need to focus on in that process. I'm pleased to say that we have again a truly excellent panel. Our chair is Joseph Sternberg, who's a Wall Street Journal columnist and member of the editorial board there. Then we have Dr. Andy Palmer, who is the president and CEO of Aston Martin Lagonda, which is obviously a company which is keenly interested in issues of global trade. Dr. Judy Shelton is the US director of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and has been an advisor to the Trump administration, and I think remains so. Finally, Glen MP is the Economic Secretary to the Treasury and the Minister for the City. So please join me in welcoming them and hearing what they have to say.
Thank you, Robert, for that introduction, and also thanks to our hosts at CPS for having us this afternoon, and thanks to all of you for coming. I am not going to introduce every member of the panel because you can read all about us in your programs already. So instead, I want to start on this talk about US-UK trade by observing that as a journalist, now is a terrific time in terms of trade because trade policy has become so interesting. After many years when there seemed to be a settled consensus behind a lot of these issues, suddenly there's a lot of debate about what exactly the path forward on trade policy should be. A lot of that debate is particularly acute here in the UK against the backdrop of Brexit. The problem is that if you are a policymaker or a business leader, trade policy has become too interesting in a way. I can entirely sympathize with a lot of people who believe that a consensus on trade policy that had seemed to be becoming established in the recent decades that has worked so well for so many businesses, for so many economies, for so many consumers, for so many workers, suddenly seems to be breaking down in important ways. The politics behind trade is changing, often dragging along trade policy with it. Certainly I think that Brexit has had some positive aspects of that in the sense that I'm not aware of a country that has confronted trade policy and debated trade in quite the way that Britain has recently, and also with quite the emphasis on openness to trade as a key rationale behind the vote for Brexit 3 years ago. But I think that we also are living in a world where the climate is a lot darker in a lot of other parts of the world. And even here in the UK, it's clear that there are going to be some political challenges too moving forward, either with a more open trading relationship with the EU, or our topic today, a more open trading relationship with the US. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to have a good discussion over the next hour about some of these challenges. And as a journalist, my instinct is actually to start with the gentleman right to my left, Andy Palmer, who comes to us from Aston Martin today, for the simple reason that oftentimes when we journalists cover trade, we are often responding to some initiative that is started in the policy-making world, and then it belatedly occurs to us that we should call up some people in the business world to get their approach to that. And so instead today, I'm actually going to give the person representing the business world on this panel his own opportunity to set the agenda by talking for a few minutes about what I think is really the main topic of this panel, which is both the opportunities for an improved trading relationship with the US during or after the Brexit process, and also some of the potential pitfalls that policymakers need to be aware of for that. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. A unique opportunity to be asked to go first. Thank you for that, I think. As a representative of the automobile industry, or of industry in general, I would say that, basically we just want to trade. And particularly through the last 3 years of the Brexit process, as you say, the rhetoric has been around everything other than the people that are actually doing the trading. And there has been, I have to say, so much bullshit that I've had to listen to around the understanding of how trade works without coming to the experts. So that's my quick pitch. Pedigree for being here. Aston Martin is a global luxury practice. Clearly, our biggest market is the United States. Our second biggest market, for what it's worth, is the US. So is the UK, and emerging in Asia. Very clearly, we're a British brand. We only make cars in the United Kingdom, and we're the only car company that's listed on the London Stock Exchange. All of our design, development, and 7,000 cars that we make every year are all made here. And we believe that basically being made in the UK, made in England, made in Wales, is a very important part of our positioning. That means, in essence, that we're not going to be making cars anywhere else in the world, because part of our raison d'etre is to be manufacturing cars in the United Kingdom and selling a little bit of the UK all around the world. But on the other hand, we're a very global country. We sell in 54 countries around the world, and it's important that we have a trade framework in which to do our business. We only do 7,000 cars a year, so each of those trades are really, really important. And as I say, our principal country of trade is with the United States. In that sense, the free trade, the principles of free trade are very important to us from a number of perspectives. The least important perspective, in fact, is the tariff. Obviously, tariff would get in the way of trade in general, but the reality is that in the luxury market, there is no US indigenous car company. All the luxury manufacturers, Ferrari, Lamborghini, Bentley, Rolls-Royce, McLaren, and ourselves, are all based in Europe. So what would happen in the case of a tariff is simply the price to the consumer will go up. The big loser, therefore, would be the US consumer. So to be avoided, but not critical. The critical bits tend to come in the use of regulations, the harmonization of regulations. Regulations potentially can be a lever to positive trade or a lever against positive trade. And the non-tariff barriers, cars being stuck at customs, or the inability to bring parts from other countries to make in our car. And in that sense, I think it's interesting to note that at the moment, 96% of an Aston Martin is either parts from the EU or parts from the UK. Therefore, given that the US is our biggest trading partner, there's a huge opportunity, in fact, for part supply to come from the US in the case of a free trade agreement where we don't have tariffs and we don't have any worries about non-tariffs. So therefore, as an opportunity for wealth creation in the United States through the supply base, as well, of course, selling the cars themselves. Very clearly, Brexit for us represents both an opportunity and a risk. If we leave in a condition where we can make trade agreements with other countries, then clearly from our point of view, the priority is only one. It's a trading relationship with the United States. And whether we do that from within the EU or do it outside of the EU, we truly want to get onto a dialogue where it's not politicians and policymakers talking about what might be possible. It's all about what the manufacturers can do in terms of realizing that trade. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. And there are a couple strands in there that I will want to pick up on as we continue our conversation. But first, I think that it's worth thinking about a major aspect of a future UK-US trading relationship that you didn't touch on in your comments, but that I think that John Glen can speak to, which is financial services, which I think inevitably is going to be a major part of, certainly of the current and definitely of the future UK-US relationship. And so I wonder if we can flesh out a little bit about some of the opportunities and the potential pitfalls from that particular aspect of the financial services industry. What are the things that we need to be keeping an eye on or be aware of as this process moves forward?
Well, thank you. I think the first thing I'd want to say is that there's a massive opportunity. The relationship culturally and politically that we have with the US is a very, very positive one. and the amount of investment by British companies in US firms, the amount invested in each other's economies is enormous. We are obviously at a key moment with respect to our future relationship with the EU and our relationship with other countries beyond the EU. I think it's really important to recognise, though, that in terms of quantum of exports, 45% is with the EU, 18% is with the US. Now, I say that not to make a political point, but just to respect the realities that we're in. Now, in terms of the process, we are in a situation where clearly we have got to resolve what the final character of our departure from the EU looks like. But that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't be invested in deepening cooperation on financial services. And indeed, the Treasury has set up a mechanism to have a thorough dialogue through the Financial Regulatory Working Group, which we set up last year. We're having deep conversations both at a commercial level, but also at a regulator-to-regulator level, because there is an enormous prize for greater cooperation in financial services. We set up the Financial Innovation Partnership last month in order to deepen those conversations. And we would and are ambitious for a wide-ranging trade deal. I think my colleague Liam Fox set that out earlier. But we can't avoid the fact that we are not at liberty to do that until we've sorted out the terms of our departure. And that's sort of frustrating, but it is where we are, unfortunately. But the appetite for a wide-ranging free trade agreement, including financial services, is there. We are often instinctively more aligned to the US in terms of how they approach regulation. I would characterize our engagement with the EU as a constructive one, but very often where we have been the voice of reason when others in the EU have sought regulations that were against the interests of the city, and then we've had to make compromises. But I go back to what I said originally. We've got to be very clear about the pivotal role we have within the continent of Europe in terms of the access to capital markets that we afford our friends on the continent. And we've got to come up with a resolution that maximises the opportunities in both directions.
Great. Well, certainly the theme that has always struck me, going back some years when these discussions come up, is that the spirit is definitely willing on a lot of these trade issues. And I mean, my sense as an American is that this is also true on the US side, that there is a real eagerness to engage on these issues, although there might also be some uncertainty about sort of the politics of doing a deal in the near term, or what sort of trading arrangement we might end up with. And I was wondering, I thought that this might be a good opportunity to then turn to my fellow American on the panel, Judy Shelton, to talk a little bit about more of a Washington or a US perspective on some of these issues, and what are the opportunities, what are the potential pitfalls, what are the things that an American is inclined to be focusing on as we talk about deepening a trading relationship with the UK?
Well, thank you, Joe, and please let me begin by saying how very much I appreciate being asked to participate in this conference being held in honor of Margaret Thatcher, for whom I have the greatest admiration. I came of age in terms of political cognizance in the mid-1980s. I had just received a postdoctoral fellowship at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, and my objective was to analyze the internal financial condition of the Soviet economy. Over the next 3 years, I would come to the conclusion that the Soviet Union was going bankrupt. During those same years, I watched as the magnificent alliance between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the political leadership they jointly exercised, which was underpinned by the moral suasion of Pope John Paul II, served to skillfully manage the decline of this most dangerous threat to the West. Together, they won the Cold War, and they changed the world. Today, I am here speaking only for myself as an American whose ancestry, according to the results of a DNA analysis I recently undertook, traces back 58% to the British Isles. Now, it also turns out that I am a direct descendant of American patriots who fought for the independence of our own land, which means I would be entitled to join an organization called Daughters of the American Revolution. So I guess you could say I have a foot in both camps. Certainly, I believe the links between the United States and the United Kingdom are fundamental to our collective identity. Our shared economic interests, national security interests, and deeply held shared values are mutually reinforcing and eminently worthy of being preserved. This conference is a testimonial to the importance of that relationship between the US and the UK, which has proven powerful and consequential. Turning to the specific topic before this panel, which focuses on the somewhat narrower issue of trade, I am proud to say, as an appointee of President Trump, that he has been enthusiastic from the start about the potential to enlarge and fortify the US-UK trade alliance. Or in his words, he wants a very, very big deal very, very quickly. But I must say, too, that serving as a member of the board of directors of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is headquartered in London, by the way. It's part of the founding charter of the EBRD, which is a multilateral development bank, that it always be headquartered in London. And here in London, I represent its largest single shareholder, the United States, which sounds good, but we still only have 10%. And suffice it to say, there are times when the prevalence of European Union members on the bank's board means that certain US objectives or preferences are handily defeated. These are usually related to wanting to apply global regulatory standards or global criteria in evaluating particular investment opportunities. And even when strong allies, such as the United Kingdom, support our cause in resisting the imposition of EU standards in favor of more broadly international standards, we quite often lose. So I fully understand that the UK faces a tough choice in deciding whether to acquiesce to the European Union, where it conducts 48% of its foreign trade, or to take a chance on developing a more flourishing relationship with the United States, which comprises at present that 18% of its trade. President Trump says he's ready for a phenomenal trade deal with Britain that could double or even triple trade between our two countries. As he stated in a tweet on the first day of his visit to London earlier this month, and I quote, "Big trade deal," and he used a capital T and a capital D, "is possible once UK gets rid of the shackles." Now, he didn't define those shackles in specific terms, but perhaps that is what we will begin to do during the course of this panel. Thank you.
Well, I want to move on and pick up a theme that I think has come out in all three of your answers in one form or another, in terms of sort of the shape that a future US-UK trade deal is going to need to take, because this is actually an instance that I think starts out as a pitfall and potentially becomes an opportunity as we move along with that process. Andy and John, you both mentioned basically non-tariff barriers, whether you're talking about non-tariff or regulatory barriers in the trade of goods. Certainly, I think that the main impediments to the trade in financial services are not tariffs, it's regulatory differences, and the part of the two parties of a deal. And my main thought looking at that is that it starts out as a big pitfall because people politically are accustomed to thinking about trade in terms of simply playing around with tariff rates. as soon as you start getting into regulatory issues, you're talking about things like chlorinated chicken or ring fencing in the financial services industry or various others of these regulatory differences. So from that perspective, it seems like a US-UK deal becomes very difficult right at the start if those are the issues that you're doing, but it seems like there's also then a big opportunity to do a trade deal that, really for the first time among some of the bigger trade deals that we've seen in the world, can be premised on trying to address a lot of these regulatory or non-tariff barriers. And I'm wondering if one or more people want to jump in on this thought of the potential opportunities, particularly to address some of these regulatory issues that tend to impede trade in the modern economy, potentially even use a US-UK trade deal where we both come from a very similar economic tradition to try to overcome some of those traditional barriers.
You're right. Regulatory stuff can be both a barrier and an accelerator, depending on how you view them. So in my business, regulatory stuff is, for example, crash testing. In Europe, we have to comply with a partially offset barrier. In the US, you have a full barrier. In the US, you have a strict regulation for rollover. In Europe, there's a very strict regulation for side impact. But at the end of the day, what do those regulations represent? They represent the best way to protect the occupant or the pedestrian. And actually, when you get down to it, and you get engineers talking to each other, there's a potential to find compromise, either to harmonize standards, which is perfect, but we live in an imperfect world, or to have a reciprocal agreement where you agree to adopt each other's standards. Now, the UK will find itself in a very strange position post-Brexit, insofar as we're not necessarily obliged to follow the EU regulations, and frankly, very likely we won't have a seat at the table that's setting those regulations, so you can imagine them potentially on a departure angle quite quickly. Neither do we have a seat at the US regulatory writing. On the other hand, if you want to look at it from a half-full point of view, there's an opportunity to try and use the UK perhaps to bring those two together, as long as parties are available to do that. And I can tell you, every car company in the world would love to see harmonization of regulations, because at the end of the day, every car company simply wants to protect its occupants in its cars or the pedestrians that run into the cars. So there's a lot of win-win there, rather than looking at it through the lens of this is going to create differentiation. We should start at it with the opportunity that being non-tariff, harmonization of regulations, or at least adoption of each other's regulations, can be a massive accelerator. Brings the cost of car development down, brings the cost of the cars down, makes exports easier.
I think the key issue is having a rational analysis of the time frame for which these decisions, when implemented, will take us. Because we talk about, and it's fascinating and exciting to think of a doubling or a tripling of our future level of trade with the US. But it isn't going to happen immediately overnight. And the challenge for the new Prime Minister and the government will be to actually examine how we satisfy what was clearly a decision by the British people to seek to have more autonomy over our trading relationships outside of the EU, whilst at the same time not putting the stable relationship that we have with many of our trading partners within Europe at risk in an interim period. And obviously, because we haven't concluded that process, it's very difficult to assert what that future dynamic with the US would look like. But it's quite clear, if you look at the way that we've interacted with our friends in the EU, that we do see things differently. And if you think about some of the rules that we have to operate under, some of the requirements that our banks and financial institutions have to operate under, there are different perspectives on how that could be done. But it's difficult to be drawn on specifics at this point, because we're obviously in a delicate process of negotiation.
Judy, it seems like part of this, at least politically in the US, and I started my career working in Washington, so I've spoken to probably more members of Congress and regulators than anyone should ever be asked to. Yeah, I think part of it is going to perhaps boil down to this question of whether the US is going to view the UK as a partner or as a competitor on some of these issues. And certainly I would prefer that the attitude be thinking of Britain as a partner for America, but particularly on something like the financial services issue, since we are sitting here in the city right now. I mean, to what extent do you see the mindset being one of the city and Wall Street sort of being partners that grow together in various ways versus being competitors where there's a danger that this sort of discussion over a future trading relationship becomes more advantage-seeking instead of liberalization for everyone's benefit?
Well, maybe it's implicit in the question that when you welcome competition through free trade or through allowing financial services to compete against your own homegrown companies, it raises the issue of rivalry, so that's natural. But if you believe in free trade, then you generally believe that that enriches everyone, and particularly consumers. As you said, the spirit is willing. I think basically America has never been afraid of competition and has rather welcomed it. But as far as negotiating a deal, it's going to depend how much give there can be on both sides, and that's the art of the deal, if you will. The main obstacles from the US point of view, I would say, have been the uncertainty over the timing, respecting your sovereignty, but not knowing exactly who will be calling the shots as Prime Minister. That's your choice to make. But also having doubts about how much room to maneuver Britain will have after Brexit, depending on where you see your own future. I agree this often gets into these very mundane issues about chlorine-washed chicken, about antibiotics in animal feed, about hormones in beef. But as I alluded to in my opening remarks, if the UK aligns with the EU on regulatory standards, it may preclude a large chunk of potential trade with the United States. And even if we could work to eliminate explicit tariffs, those non-tariff barriers would still present a significant problem for US suppliers, because we want comprehensive access for agricultural goods, and that includes genetically modified crops. I suppose to most Americans, they would say, if you don't want to purchase them, don't. People should have a choice. But when we would try to push those arguments, I think there's a real strong political pushback that kind of taints the debate, in that it sounds like we're trying to contaminate your food supply or compromise your healthcare system. And so that tends to cast a negative light on the whole effort. I will say that a recent study, insofar as the rivalry of, say, whether Wall Street and New York is going to be taking away business from the city and London, I think the perception is that London has already fallen somewhat. At least there was a survey conducted that showed people in the financial sector thought that New York was winning out as the global financial hub. But what was also interesting in that survey is going out 5 years, London fell even more. But even as New York gained some of that, there was a sense that Asian financial capitals were on the rise, whether Hong Kong or Singapore. And I was very struck when your chancellor appeared at the London Stock Exchange last week, and at his side was the vice premier of China, and it was to establish a link between the London Stock Exchange and the Shanghai Stock Exchange. So that kind of sends signals to us in terms of what you're looking for with regard to global connectivity. And so I suppose I could say we'd like to see signs that you would like to have stronger ties with U.S. financial markets as well.
Now, John, I saw you shaking your head a little bit.
Well, I think this
there.
is a selective use of one survey. I mean, frankly, the buoyancy of the City of London over the last 3 years has been remarkable. It's obvious there's been some contingency arrangements conditional on what is happening with the final relationship with the EU. But the resilience of the city is very clear. I was at the stock exchange with the Chancellor, and it's absolutely true that we are seeking deepening global relationships. And last year he announced the global financial partnerships, which are about deepening regulatory cooperation, government to government, regulator to regulator, in jurisdictions including the US, Singapore, and beyond. This isn't an either or, it's about maximizing advantage in multiple jurisdictions. If what a free trade agreement with the US is about is an exclusive, prioritized tie-up, then it's not clear to me that that's where the direction we're going, because our economic interests as a country rely on strong future trading relationships in the EU, beyond the EU into Asia, and the US as well. It's not possible at this moment in time. You yourself set out the uncertainty around who's going to be Prime Minister, the nature of the negotiations. So I can't sit here and tell you exactly how this is going to end up, but the appetite for a deeper and stronger trading relationship with the US is absolutely clear. How we deliver it in the choreography of that will depend on the negotiations that happen in the next 6 months.
I think that one point that really comes out from this discussion, and Andy, I want to come back to you to follow up on something that really struck me in your comments at the beginning of our discussion, is just the extent to which trade has become so much more complicated than I think that your average woman or man on the street understands now. And I find that has some fascinating and challenging political consequences. And
Can I just say on that? I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a rather oversimplified discussion. What we should be talking about is what are the outcomes that we need in terms of consumer protection, and there are different ways of achieving that. And I think what people are frustrated by is the over-prescriptive nature of some of those rules that have derived from our involvement in the EU. And what they're looking for is greater freedom. We subscribe to the same need to avoid systemic risk to our financial system, but what we don't want to prescribe is rules to a level that actually doesn't give us any autonomy within our own national life.
Well, I'm just speaking for myself. But the United States is at kind of a critical moment with regard to not just the trade, but the overall relationship with China. And I think that we have felt that even though other countries recognized for a long time certain practices that maybe were not healthy for the principles of free trade and a level playing field, that it really took this moment, and I would have to say this president, to challenge China in a way that's potentially putting a burden on our own economic prospects, but willing to go for it, thinking that we're going to end up in a better place. And I think the rest of the world will benefit if that happens with regard to joint ventures and intellectual property and some of the complaints that people have had toward China. But actually our Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, addressed this organization earlier, and I think he specifically warned about the pitfall involving Britain's stance on trading with China, and of course it's with regard to Huawei technology. And I believe in his comments, he suggested, he even invoked Margaret Thatcher as someone who would have been more wary about China, especially given their record on human rights. But for us, there's also the matter of the theft of corporate secrets or cyber espionage. I started out working during transition as the lead advisor at our Treasury for international affairs, and I can tell you that CFIUS, our Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, has really become more aggressive under the Trump administration in its policing of foreign investment in the United States. We have a very rigorous review system that's aimed at preventing China from gaining access to sensitive American technology. Now, it's not just China. Any foreign transaction involving a business that designs or produces technology related to 27 industries, including telecom, semiconductors, and computers. It's just, it turns out China's the main target for their practice of pursuing valuable American technology through what we consider nefarious means, including trying to obtain trade secrets by investing in US companies. So I understand that the Chancellor has confirmed Britain's ambition to okay a bigger part in China's controversial infrastructure projects, their Belt and Road Initiative. And I understand some people are supportive of China's involvement in financing so many developing countries around the world, but we're concerned that sometimes this leads to debt traps that work for China but aren't necessarily in the best interests of the recipient country.
Well, again, I think that ties into a theme, and this is something that I would like to ask Andy about, is this issue, again, I think that the big lesson for a lot of people from the Huawei controversies has been realizing that you can have an industry like, walking into your O2 or your Vodafone shop to get mobile phone service, and you don't necessarily think that that service is exposed to international trade beyond the fact that you might be using a South Korean or a Chinese-made handset. And yet, actually, there is quite a lot of trade exposure in that industry in terms of the equipment that's used to build out the network infrastructure. And it just speaks to this broader theme of the complexity of these trading relationships that people are realizing. Now, Andy, the point that you made that really brought this home for me is the point that, from your perspective, a trade deal with the U.S. isn't just about your ability to export finished cars to America, but also the potential for you to import and for America to export components for those cars. And I wonder if sometimes that is an aspect of these relationships that can be missing from the political discussion if you're only thinking about the finished product and a certain amount of nationalism associated with American cars versus foreign cars, missing the fact that a car that has the Aston Martin mark on the front of it might still have the potential for a lot of American manufactured components inside. I mean, can you talk a little bit more about that supply chain element of these discussions and some of the opportunities that there are actually for deepening relations between the two countries in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would speak as the trader, and at a very simplistic level, I think we need to be able to trade and then afterwards think about the complexities, and there's undoubtedly lots and lots of complexities. But at its heart, the policymakers need to help me, the people I represent, trade, first of all, rather than putting the barriers in the way. Key point. To make it a little bit illustrative in terms of the complexity of being a manufacturer or a trader, Aston Martin is not a big company. It makes 7,000 cars a year. But what does that mean? That means that we bring on site from suppliers 12.3 million parts every year. So 12.3 million systems arrive at our factory every year, and they have to arrive in a 30-minute window, because the 30-minute window is what's called in the industry the takt time, and it's the time you've got to fit that part onto the car before the belt moves to the next station. Imagine that. Imagine the complexity of that 12.3 million bits in a 30-minute window, and then try and put that into the context of relatively simplified arguments that I often hear around Brexit and international trade. That's what we're trying to do. That's why we need as little friction as possible. When you buy an Aston Martin, and I know you have an Aston in the family, she's a great lady, Yes, you buy a little piece of Great Britain. It's an emotional purchase, and we put them together by hand. However, we are a global company, and we have to use parts from the best suppliers all around the world. And today, to be precise, 64% of the parts that go into your Aston come from the EU. Now, when you put the total content together, it's including what we put into the car. The so-called local content of our car is around about 62% UK, but the parts are coming predominantly from the EU. And I think that's a pity, because the 2.5% parts tariff, which is the tariff for bringing parts from the US, 2.5% tax is a big deal, because the margins on cars are quite small, so we source parts according to the most effective way of getting them into the factory. And we have not zero content, US content, but quite low degrees of US content. But some of the greatest suppliers, automotive suppliers in the world, are based in the United States. Some of the technology that's moving into technologies like autonomous driving are coming from Silicon Valley. And because of that tariff, we're not able to use it. And that's a crying shame for US suppliers. And I guess what I'm saying is, tariff just destroys business. Either because it gets too expensive, or because of the difficulty of getting the parts to line, because the friction at the borders. And if you can open those out, it's not just a question of Aston Martin selling a few more cars in the United States, which it definitely will, but it's sharing some of that wealth with US suppliers who are among some of the greatest in the world. And that's why I prefer that, rather than going straight to the political difficulties of what gets in the way, let's get back to basics, which is, let's just make free trade happen and deal with the stuff that happens around it. It's an appeal to both sides of the Atlantic.
I agree.
Those are my customers, by the way.
Now, one aspect, Judy, you mentioned President Trump's recent visit to the UK, and one element of this trading relationship that I think emerged from that we haven't really talked about yet, other than the context of financial services, and this is the part where everyone is going to become very uncomfortable, services more broadly. Certainly the president generated more than a few headlines over here talking about the desire for American companies to have greater access to the healthcare marketplace in the UK. But I think that there seems to be enormous potential for trade in professional services, other services, whether it's linked also to the trade in goods or just services as standalone products between the two. And I'd be interested to hear some general views from other members of the panel about how one moves forward with that. I mean, does that, and also the extent to which potentially we need to be thinking about these trade issues, not just in terms of the agreement that we negotiate with the bilateral counterpart who's sitting across the table from us, but I mean, what I thought was interesting about the healthcare debate here was the extent to which you realized that a trade negotiation with the US that includes a comprehensive service chapter might also expect some domestic reforms in the UK. And I think that the American version of that might be if a financial services component requires a revisiting in America of some elements of the Dodd-Frank financial reform in order to solve some of these regulatory problems. So maybe we can talk in very broad terms without necessarily putting anyone on the spot directly about healthcare, but just the relationship between some of these domestic policy debates that are ongoing, on a variety of these issues in both countries, and how that ties in to the discussions that will be going on a trade deal. Who's brave enough to go first?
Well, I'd just say quite straightforwardly, I mean, the way that the US and the British healthcare systems operate and the expectations of our different populations are very, very different. And the National Health Service is, unique. Now, there's a whole debate over the reform that we've got and the investment that we are making over the coming years. But this rather underscores the complexity of these discussions, because this sometimes instinct to make it a simple choice between do we orient towards the EU or the US, and are we in favor of free trade or not, is of course complicated by the political pressures and sincere concerns that exist amongst our population on all sides of politics around the future of a service that is actually enshrined in a different way in our national psyche. So you can't just ride roughshod over that, because it's something quite fundamental to our national life. And what you've got to do is say, well, where have we got common ground for agreement in other areas where there is an advantage to both economies, and that's what that negotiation would need to cover. But we've got to be realistic as well, because certainly if we took that back to Parliament, I see some of my colleagues here, I don't think we'd be having an easy time with it, and that's just the political cold reality of life.
Well, I think the goal is to break down barriers and to provide more choices and to be more open-minded. For the United States, our pursuit, and I'm thinking specifically with China, is wanting to have access to their markets, not trying to close them off from entering ours, but rather to make it reciprocal. That's always been the main,
totally legitimate aspiration.
The main objective. And I would even go so far as to mention that President Trump proposed, particularly in trade talks with Europe, the idea of a 0-0-0 approach. 0 tariffs, 0 non-tariff barriers, 0 subsidies. And unfortunately, there have been very few takers. It's almost as if people are entrenched in the tariff structure that has grown up as a result of these negotiations and what's in it for me and what's in it for you. Whereas if you can eliminate those and enhance opportunities for people to appreciate the very fine products from Britain, of which I was very happy to tell Andy about my husband driving the Aston DB11 12-cylinder and saying it's a fantastic car. So maybe if we can get some successful negotiations out of this, more parts could be made in the United States, and I guarantee there would be many auto workers only too thrilled to be working and producing your car. So I really applaud. I find the instincts of businessmen and women are so honest and go to the core of the issue. So we keep having to come back to that, I think. We should keep coming back to that idea of not free trade as a series of platitudes, but in pragmatic thinking, how we can actually get rid of tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and subsidies. And I also want to commend you for your marketing skills as a businessman, because he was quick to tell me that if my husband's driving that model, that I should be getting the new SUV.
There's a DBX coming out in December, and anybody that wants to buy it, let me know.
But that will be the solution to a better economic and trade alliance and financial alliance between our countries, if we don't lose sight of the people who are in the arena producing. And business is risky by definition. So I think it's incumbent on governments to make the environment for increasing business as hospitable as possible, and to eliminate so many of the obstacles that turn out to be bureaucratic as much as other legal barriers.
Agree with that.
Now, we'll be approaching the end of our time soon, so I'm going to ask the panelists 2 final questions, a difficult question and a very difficult question.
Thanks for that.
So the difficult question is this, and we've kind of danced around this in a couple of different forms in our conversation this afternoon. It came up when we were talking about the China angle, whether it was the security of Huawei products or deepening financial ties between the city and Shanghai and in terms of financial services. Andy has talked about this a bit in the terms of the complexity of his supply chain, but certainly it seemed to me that one problem that you have if you're having a panel discussion about the prospects for a US-UK trade deal is that it isn't really only the US and the UK who are involved in this sort of thing. I mean, the nature of global trade nowadays is that any bilateral negotiation between the US and the UK is going to happen against the backdrop of the fact that both countries are also trading extensively with the rest of the world, have particular interests in terms of advancing more liberal trade or domestic reforms in others of those trading partners. And so, I wonder if we can just talk a little bit more about this theme that it is in a way, now we can't talk only about a US-UK deal. There is an element of multidimensional chess to this, whether you're thinking about what is the relationship between both the US and Britain going to be with China, or the even more pressing question of what is the relationship going to be between the UK and the remaining members of the EU, moving into a phase where Britain might be able to negotiate some of these deals.
Well, I just go back to what I said initially. I think we're in a state of flux. We can't determine exactly what we're going to do at this point, but the work that's going on with multiple jurisdictions, and particularly the US, to explore the basis for a very broad and wide-ranging free trade agreement is happening. You're right to characterize the challenge as being a multidimensional chess game, but at the same time, that's always been the nature of complex trading relationships. We've got to really focus on what are the guiding principles, which is to ease the frictions that Andy and his colleagues have to deal with, to maximize the growth opportunities on both sides, and to relieve business of the burdens, often unnecessary ones, that intrude on their ability to create shareholder value and actually deliver products more efficiently to the market. And that imperative, I think, is lost if we aren't able to take bold new decisions very soon on the back of a finalization of this journey, which is obviously taking too long.
Andy, maybe you have some perspective. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but certainly the thought that I often hear from people in the business community I talk to about these issues is a certain sense of not wanting policymakers to think that it has to be one or the other, because actually I get the impression that what a lot of businesses really need is a trade policy that is liberal towards all comers.
I reckon you read my notes then.
Oh.
Well done. I don't want to choose, frankly. Exactly. I don't want to choose not trading freely with the EU in order to trade with the US or to exclude China. I need to trade everywhere. 54 countries that we trade with. Some of them are in free trade, some of them are in tariffs. I'd rather they were free everywhere. In the same way that I would say I'd love to see American parts on the car, I'd happily see Chinese parts on the car. As long as they're best of breed. And we're sitting in a Margaret Thatcher arena, right, where I guess her philosophy was one of Darwinism. I'm not a student of Mrs. Thatcher, but I was around. And Darwinism creates best of breed. Best of breed in the auto industry, and I think every industry is what you want. You want the best manufacturers, the best suppliers, and the best dealers all over the world. So in that sense, I buy into that Darwinism, and we as a manufacturer have to live up against the likes of Ferrari and Lamborghini that are also trying to be best of breed. I guess there's going to be some exceptions. I guess in that discussion, I can easily imagine the NHS being a bit of a red line, and I'm sure there's an American treasure that probably needs to be acknowledged in a discussion. So it may not be full reciprocity. That's a hard word, isn't it? But somehow or other, the majority of it needs to be Darwinism and create the best of breed by, as much as possible, free trade everywhere. But I don't want to choose. I mean, it's in the same way as coming out. If we come out of Europe and then can't trade, that seems to me to be the worst of all worlds. If we're going to come out, we're going to go into Brexit, then we need to be able to have free trade agreements all over the world. And with Europe, I mean, they're an important trading bloc as well. Whilst the US represents about 30% of Aston Martin sales, the EU represents about 17%. It's an important market as well. China is increasingly important. So I'm sure I speak on behalf of all manufacturers, basically. Don't make us choose.
Judy, I think the US is in an interesting position on this front, particularly under President Trump, because I take your point earlier about how he has been trying to raise some awkward questions that certainly many politicians in the U.S. have been uncomfortable about with aspects of these trading relationships over the years. I have wondered sometimes if there isn't a danger, though, that what I perceive to be his tendency to think of trade solely in bilateral terms might end up being a missed opportunity for the U.S. to sort of think more broadly about, not just a great trade deal with the U.K., not just solving whatever trade problems we have with China, but thinking about it in a more holistic sense. I mean, what's your perspective on sort of where things might be, where we might be able to take that discussion in the U.S.?
Well, I might say that before he was elected president, Donald Trump as a candidate on many occasions, and I was listening very carefully, proclaimed himself to be very much in favor of free trade. What he had, in my view, the courage to point out is that we make lots of references to this rules-based global economy. And usually people are referring back to the Bretton Woods institutions that came about at the eve of World War II in 1944. And they act as if he was trying to blow all that up. And I would say just the opposite. I think he was saying we're kidding ourselves if we think that we have a level playing field here. I mean, just an easy one is the most important institution from the Bretton Woods era was the creation of the International Monetary Fund. People forget that was a fixed exchange rate system anchored by a dollar convertible into gold. So you had fixed exchange rates. So the whole reason Bretton Woods, the architects, a Briton and an American, designed that system was to give hope to the Allied powers who were fighting the war that there would be a better future where they would have trading opportunities, where capital would flow to its best use, where you wouldn't have what they'd experienced in the prior decade, beggar thy neighbor, competitive depreciation of currencies. So for me, when I heard President Trump talking about currency manipulation as being antithetical to free trade, I was all in. I agree. I don't think it's fair for auto workers in Michigan or Ohio to do their best work to produce, because there's competition in an open global marketplace, a car that would be attractive to buyers around the world. And the whole idea of free markets is the more suppliers and the more potential consumers, the higher value for the lowest price, because that's what everyone is striving to achieve. So if you believe in all that, but then the terms of trade can be changed by a shift in currencies, then through no fault of their own, the people who have created what they hoped would be the best value for the lowest price are ostracized. They can't compete against that. So whether it's, say, the People's Bank of China that sets the exchange rate every day and fixes it and says this is what it will be, or if it's the more subtle competition between the European Central Bank and our Federal Reserve, where the utterances of a central banking official moves currency markets if they refer to additional stimulus. It's that kind of changing the terms of trade in ways that really aren't fair, where you don't have a level playing field, that I think he has tried to point out. So I hope that we can try to concentrate on how to facilitate fair trade, and I don't mean that in a protectionist way. Sometimes that term is used that way. What I'm talking about is really letting the cream rise to the top in the Darwinian way to which you referred. And that means granting as many people who are willing to compete in the global marketplace the opportunity to do so without artificial obstacles that cut them off before they even have a chance to get in there.
Great. Well, we have 2 minutes left, and I said that was the difficult question. The very difficult question, at least I think, lends itself to a short but highly speculative answer, and that is, how likely do you think a US-UK trade agreement is? At least in the next couple of years, I think, if we set that as the time horizon. And maybe we can finish off by talking about how optimistic or pessimistic we are that a deal of that sort can come together.
Well, I'm always an optimist. I think the appetite's there. The conditions we know need to be resolved with the EU, but I am optimistic that we will achieve that, and I think that the time frame is more difficult to determine, but I would think 3 years is something we should be aiming for.
Well, I might just point out, it's not an entirely new idea. In 2008, the Heritage Foundation was pushing the idea that Britain could join NAFTA, and together with the United States, Canada, and Mexico, have a mutually beneficial trade zone that didn't rely on a super state in any parliamentary way. Now, that idea apparently is being resurrected. It was favored by Senator Phil Gramm in the United States, who was an economics professor and was also chairman of our Senate Banking Committee. So I just think we need to be open-minded, and all options should be out there for consideration. I want to quote Theresa May in January 2017. She said, "It's time for Britain to get out into the world and rediscover its role as a great global trading nation." To which I say, hear, hear.
And Andy, I think we can let you have the last word.
Started and finished. Huh? It's amazing. Look, as far as I know, the Conservative Party is pledged to make a Brexit happen, and probably its existence in future relies on making it happen. That might be a little controversial. And I believe President Trump has said he's open to a phenomenal deal. I just ask you to restore my faith in politics and make it happen, guys.
Thank you.
Well, that is a very optimistic note for us to end on.
That's right.
So thank you to my fellow panelists, and I think that we will let you all escape for a few minutes to stretch your legs before the next speaker.
Thank you.